Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to give you a top 10 list of how to understand basic woke speak. Go into the Orwellian meanings and history of some of these things briefly so that the average Joe can really understand what these quote unquote progressive people mean when they use these words or catchphrases or try to explain a situation in a very specific way. And I'm doing this for several reasons. Number one being, although I have degrees in history and classics and philosophy, what I mainly concentrated on was political theory, which is where do ideas come from and how do they interact with us when we try to use them in an analytical way. Well, at the very least, that's the part of political theory that I focused on. Number two, because my channel is built around the idea of a traditional hero, and all of this unclear language destroys the idea of a hero within the page and within the lives of so many of us. And number three, because I just figured this would be a quick video, whereas most of the week and really for this next week, I just opened my third campaign for my third graphic novel over on Indiegogo. The graphic novel is Crom the Destroyer. It is a love letter to low fantasy in a Robert E. Howard fashion to try to take those old Celtic myths and create a character like Kull, like Conan, like Solomon Kane. The story starts out on a battlefield and just goes uphill from there. I'll give you some of the lettered pages in the background to show you some of the story. So if it looks interesting to you in any way, click on the link in the description and in the pinned comment and go and get your copy today. It's a story that centers around death and honor, where men are real men and women are real women. And that segues nicely into number one on our list of Woke Speak 101. And that is toxic masculinity, because my book would be seen as toxic masculinity. But what exactly is toxic masculinity? And more importantly, what is the distinction between how normal people are supposed to see it, i.e., how the quote unquote progressive left portray it to the normal everyday people, and what they themselves, the initiated into this language, actually understand the phrase to mean? It is portrayed to the general public as meaning that there are parts of masculinity that are toxic, that is to say, that are corrosive to the social good. But in actuality, since this can be applied to anything that has to deal with masculinity, that is to say, it can be applied to any masculine trait whatsoever, what the quote unquote initiated into this language actually know it to mean is that everything that has to do with masculinity is toxic and, although they don't use this word, in some way evil. This is a product of feminist ideology, which starting in the late 70s, right on through the 80s and into the 90s, this scholarship quite specifically used its leverage within academia to A, falsify studies, B, cherry pick data and statistics, and feed those into the academic system, and from there into the justice system to portray women as always being the victim, always being saintly, and men always being demonic, always being destructive. And now that feminism is part of the mainstay of modern culture, feminists and their intellectual counterparts that still exist within academia come right out and say it. They freely admit that yes, this data that was fed into all of these systems that they were trying to overhaul and change according to feminism, it was made up. It was cherry-picked, and they did this quite specifically for this purpose, to portray men as always evil and women as always good. And that really is the heart of the definition of toxic masculinity. Men equal evil, women equal good. And this leads right into our number two on our list, which is mansplaining. Mansplaining, quite simply, is explaining something according to a masculine perspective, or a masculine way of dealing with things, which, if we go back to number one, we know is an evil way of dealing with things because everything connected to the masculine is characterized as toxic and evil. This is given its own word because, of course, there is a difference between how men deal with conversation and how women deal with conversation. Men typically deal with conversation and interaction with others in a problem-solving mentality, whereas women deal with it in much more of a social cohesion mentality. And once again, referring to our definition number 1 of toxic masculinity, that masculine way of dealing with things according to problem solving is toxic and evil. Why? Well, because when women who are concentrated on social cohesion begin a conversation, they're not actually looking to solve a problem, because problem solving might actually lead to social disconnect of people within that conversation, because not everybody is going to agree. No, women are looking for a version of confirmation bias. That is to say, let us start a conversation so we can each support each other in the ideas that we already have. This then leads into number 3 on our list, which is empathy. Now, why does this belong on the list? Well, again, I deal with mostly comic books and the production of fantasy and science fiction stories. Part of my analysis is to look at the podcasts and the statements of these people from the major companies that actually deal with them. Quite specifically, I look at Marvel, and this is a word that comes up over and over again and was expressed most keenly by the second in command at Marvel for about 10 years between 2010 and 2020, who said, sure, we have the action, but the real heart of the story is, does the character have empathy? And what these quote unquote progressive people mean by using the word empathy is not actually empathy, but sympathy. Because empathy means to feel with other people, to feel the exact same feelings that they do along with them. But you can't have that because, again, that might lead into empathizing with people who are not of the same ideological bent. So it leads right back into the idea of confirmation bias. But again, confirmation bias, which is based upon the idea of toxic masculinity, that is to say that only one form of thinking is correct, that is the female way of thinking in a quote unquote progressive way. This is why you need to sympathize with very specific people. Once again, building that social cohesion rather than looking for the answer to any real specific problem. And this has attached to it the quote unquote progressive left idea that reason itself is part of toxic masculinity and the supremacy of a certain light-skinned kind of people. I will put up in the background the statement from the Smithsonian Institute stating that reason and logical thinking is indeed part of this toxic landscape of society. Reason and logic are not only 100% opposed to the idea of sympathy at every turn, but at the same time also play back into the idea of toxic masculinity. Why? Well, because the quote-unquote progressive left is stating right here, and quite specifically it is true, that men and women deal with things in different ways. And the male way to deal with things is through typically a more rational and logical perspective, whereas women deal with things in an emotional way. And this is known to be a general rule for the difference between men and women because of the biological differences, I would say most notably within the brain and within the eye structure, that gear men towards a more mechanical way of thinking and women towards a more emotional way of thinking. I deal, again, with sequential art that has a lot to do with the visual, and we understand from scientific studies that from the very first moments that a baby can actually pick out things more than just a blob of color with their eyes, boys tend to gravitate more towards the mechanical, and girls tend to gravitate more towards human faces. This has to do with the eye structure and how there is different cellular eye structure within males and females, so that the male eye can see shapes and movement better, and the female eye doesn't see those shapes and movements better, but can see things like a heightened color palette, which allows, again, them to pick out more subtle differences within analyzing human faces and the meaning behind body language, etc. And knowing this, we understand that since men, from the very time there are little children, have an eye structure that gear them towards the mechanical, they're attracted to more mechanical ways of thinking, and I would say this is part of the brain structure as well, that deals with things like logic and reason because they are mechanical ways of thinking. And again, women are tended naturally towards a more empathetic, but in this case, we're talking about sympathetic way of thinking and then interacting with people. And this is quite specifically focused on by your quote unquote progressive left because they want people to abandon reason, once again, see that Smithsonian article, and concentrate on empathy because reason and logic are the male way of dealing with things, which is part of toxic masculinity, and it serves the purpose of the ideology because this ideology is not based upon logic and reason. And if you bring logic and reason and problem solving into the equation, into the political discourse, you will find that quote unquote progressivism falls apart fairly quickly. So if your quote unquote progressive ideology is not based upon logic and reason, then what is it based upon? Well, it's based upon circular reasoning, as we've just seen from just these three definitions themselves and the way that they're understood by the progressive left. It is an interlocking system of self-support where one points to another, points to another, points to another in a circular way so that they support themselves and there's no outside connection to actual reality, which then can be analyzed by logic and reason. And so to complete that circle for these first three definitions, we have definition number 4, which is of empowerment. Again, I deal with science fiction and fantasy stories, most notably superhero stories. You hear the word power over and over again. Quite specifically, power is at the heart of your quote unquote progressive ideology. It is based upon ideas that were expressed, I would say, as their proximate cause, but really not their origin cause because they've been around in human society forever and a day. But the proximate cause within our current history would be atheistic communistic ideas of Marx, which is to say that there is nothing that actually exists within reality except for power structures, which then can be manipulated in a social way. And so, if you look at feminist literature and so called scholarship, you will see that there is a clear distinction between power and empowerment. By power is meant masculine power, which is to say, once again, according to toxic masculinity, must in itself be corrosive and destructive, which is always this way. It is in itself, at its core, evil. And empowerment means a feminine way of exercising power, which again is defined within feminist literature as always being creative, constructive, and cooperational. Now let's move on to number 5, which is DEI, which stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is entered into the picture as a reflection of diverse thought. That is to say, a non-rational way of thinking. Why? Because rationality depends upon judgment. This is one of the steps which necessarily must be there in order to get to rationality. And when you make a judgment about things, defining them as they exist within reality, you naturally exclude some things which don't belong in the conversation. Again, this leads into the inclusion part of DEI. Diversity, once again, deals with a way of thinking which says that since there can't be a judgment made upon things, because we can't know anything according to this structure where there is just power and social forces, then all ideas are actually valid. But once again, that draws back into ideas like toxic masculinity and mansplaining and empathy, which says that really only a certain number of those are actually acceptable, which once again are those that support your quote unquote progressive ideology. And equity is included in this because once again, it leads back into this proximate cause of Marxist thinking. And once again, it goes earlier than that, but that's the connection within our modern history. It's the idea that has cropped up over and over again and is expressed, I would say, most notably within a mythological or even religious way, that the original state of mankind was some kind of golden age, where in the Bible it is a Garden of Eden. However, within your atheistic Marxism, which again is the proximate cause, it has the same idea, but that idea is that this golden age existed for mankind in prehistory, wherein everyone lived in peace and harmony, and it wasn't until a certain number of greedy people got together and started to create systems and institutions which forced others into first the idea of, and then the actual living out of, scarcity of resources, which then leads to competition, which then leads to capitalism, which in itself as an entire system leads to suffering. So again, the idea is that if we get rid of capitalism, mankind can go back to that equitable golden age where everybody gets exactly the same and everybody gets exactly what they need to survive. Because once again, it's a Garden of Eden substitute for an atheistic Marxist ideology. And as I said, diversity and inclusion are attached to equity because equity really is what they're looking for to go back to this golden age through the destruction of capitalism, and it is supported by not actually applying logical and rational thinking to it because, once again, if you do so, it will fall apart. Therefore, we must have diversity and inclusion that destroys ideas of reason and logic because all ideas, but really only approved political ideas from the progressive left, are acceptable, and you can't apply an exclusionary factor wherein you can analyze things according to how things actually exist in reality, because that would break apart this utopian ideal that is being reached for. And although it's not part of my top 10 list, I should enter the definition of tolerance according to the quote-unquote progressive left in here. And the idea of progressive tolerance isn't the actual definition of tolerance. The actual definition of tolerance is basically to put up something that you know to be wrong, that you know to be off. Since we tolerate a bad smell, you don't tolerate a nice day. But the progressive definition of tolerance is part and parcel of diversity and inclusion. That is to say, you must accept everything that allows for a plethora of new ideas to come in, because this deluge of ideas will mean, once again, that you can't analyze things according to a logical and rational perspective. Because, quite simply, you can't define things, you can't use judgment, which is necessary for reason. So really, the progressive definition of tolerance is the exact opposite of the logical definition of judgment. It's inclusion to an absurd point, wherein only absurdity can be observed in what you are so-called discussing. So from there, let's move on to number 6 on the list, which is systemic blank. Because it could be a number of things. It could be systemic misogyny. It could be systemic racism. It could be systemic phobia of one kind or another. This once again points back to that utopian ideal that I was just speaking of, the idea of a golden age at the beginning of history that got corrupted by the ideas of capitalism. All of those ideas that make up everything that creates suffering in our world are part of this capitalist system, which was originally set up to destroy the ideas of equity, diversity, inclusion, that is to say, the utopian existence of mankind. And this is what systemic blank actually refers to. Because the underlying mechanism that is at play when people use the phrase of systemic blank is the idea that if we can only get rid of this system, then we can go back to a more equitable, inclusive, diverse way of living, which once again points back to that utopian ideal. And this leads straight into number 7 on our list, which is blank rights are human rights. And again, you can substitute a plethora of things in place of that blank, all of which are connected to the quote-unquote progressive left, of course. Now, this one has a lot of people scratching their heads because a lot of people view rights in the American way. That is to say that there are unalienable rights. But here's the thing, especially for people who live in the United States, which is not only the core of my audience, but really the core of so much entertainment that is made. The idea of unalienable rights is not a widespread thing. America is really the only major country that appeals to unalienable rights. The only other large institution that I can think of off the top of my head that actually appeals to unalienable rights would be the Catholic Church. But the point is that for almost the entire world, except for America, the idea of rights is based upon the fact that the government grants you those rights. Now, this is what is behind the statement of, I think it was it Washington or Thomas Jefferson, who said, any government that is powerful enough to grant you rights is powerful enough to take them away from you. And this is what happens in the rest of the world. Rights are not unalienable in other countries. They are viewed as something granted to you by the societal controlling system, which is the government, and therefore they can take them away from you, and therefore they can grant you extra and special privileges and rights as well. Because the idea of unalienable rights runs contrary, straight contrary, to the ideas of quote-unquote progressive ideology. Unalienable rights almost always, but not in every case, applies to an idea of a creator, applies to an idea of natural law, which in itself applies to ideas of logic and reason, wherein we can understand the universe around us, our human nature, and how that all plays together and plays out within human existence. But again, none of that is actually considered within quote-unquote progressive ideology. Why? Because everything is according to simple power and social dynamics. So none of those things, like natural law, actually have any standing whatsoever when you apply progressive ideology to a situation. So since progressive ideology runs 100% contrary to the idea of unalienable rights, but they still believe in rights, they believe in rights that are granted to you by the government, and therefore the government can grant you extra and special privileges and rights, and this is what blank rights or human rights actually means. It means that these certain number of people should be granted extra and special rights and privileges, and the government can do that because it's the one that grants rights. And once again, this is the progressive ideology twisting language so that the actual average Joe will hear the idea of human rights and will naturally think about unalienable rights because these rights are supposedly in the mind connected within this phrase to the idea of human rights, human existence itself, which leads back to ideas of unalienable rights, but it's actually quite contrary to that. To the initiated, to the people who understand this language and how it's used, it is simply sticking human in there to make that false connection in order to sell the idea that rights are granted by the government and certain people should be granted extra privileges and rights. And why should such people, really groups of people, be granted these extra privileges and rights? Well, that leads right into number 8 on our list, which is anti-racism. Anti-racism is really a new phrase that was coined, I think, by Ibram X. Kendi, and his idea behind it is that it's no longer enough for people to be free from racism itself. They must take an extra step and be anti-racist. And what does anti-racist mean? Well, according to his ideology, the only way, and these are his words, to rectify past discrimination is present and future discrimination. Now let's take that statement of his and substitute discrimination for what he really means, because he's coining the term anti-racism here. Well, he's basically saying that past racism can only be countered by current and future racism. And since racism, according to his definition and the quote-unquote progressive left definition of things, always goes historically in the direction of white people against non-white people, that entire thing must be flipped so that we now have racism of non-white people against white people. So the term anti-racism is literally code for the setting up of institutional racism against white people. And this can be used in a number of different forms and leads right back into, as I said, number 6, which is systemic blank. Why? Because the idea, the Marxist idea, once again, is that this utopia should have continued to play out throughout history if greedy old capitalism didn't come into the picture, and greedy old capitalism set up these systems of interference for that equity. Therefore, these systems must be gotten rid of. These systemic misogynistic institutions, etc., must be destroyed, taken out of our society completely, because it's all about societal forces. And the way that we do this is we set up a counterbalancing system within our society that will work against and destroy those original systems. So if we have systemic racism, which is in favor of white people, then we must set up systemic racism that is against white people in order to balance the scales, in order to get rid of these systemic institutions that are evil, and then bring us back to a utopian ideal where there is nothing but diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is the entire reason behind why certain people and certain groups of people should be, in the progressive mind, granted extra privileges and rights, because it sets up an institution, because rights in their mind are nothing more than an institution made by a government. They set up an institution where these people have more power in order to turn the tables on their oppressors and then oppress them, which again is just Marxist ideology. And this leads us to number 9 on our list, which is lived experience. When people trot out the phrase lived experience, once again, they're pointing right back to that idea of blank rights are human rights, or to say it in another way, that rights themselves are not unalienable, but they are granted by the government. And this idea leads back into the destruction of natural law, which is to say that really we can't know anything about human existence, and there's no such understanding of human nature. Such doesn't exist. Only societal forces according to power dynamics actually exist. Therefore, we can't look at whether or not people are human and have a common trait between them. No, we have to look at their experiences, because that's the only thing that plays out according to societal forces. Therefore, when you look at a person's lived experience, that's the entire makeup of who they are as a person, even who they are as a human being, because there's no fixed human nature. Or to put it more simply, the idea of lived experience is that you are not human in any substantial way that is objective. You're only human according to the makeup of your experiences. And this leads into the nasty conclusion when you add into it things like systemic blank, which usually is racism, or toxic masculinity, that there are a certain kind of people that act in a certain kind of way, which is in itself toxic and evil. Therefore, this is their lived experience. Therefore, those people in themselves, simply by experiencing these things in their lives, are toxic and evil. Therefore, once again, it's entirely acceptable to not only demonize, but also persecute and prosecute, and possibly even extinguish these groups of people, because, of course, their existence is counter to the social good. And then we can move on to number 10 on our list, which is representation. Why is there so much of a push within society, and specifically things like entertainment, for quote-unquote representation? Well, the idea of representation, once again, goes back to the ideas expressed within lived experience. That is to say, that people are made up of nothing more than their experiences. They are nothing else than their experiences. Therefore, two people cannot connect to each other unless they have the same lived experiences. Therefore, you need to represent within your media, within your government, within anything that has to deal with social forces, you need to represent the good people, which is the marginalized people, which is the people who believe in progressivism, because the only way that the audience, whether they be people engaged in politics or watching a movie, the audience cannot connect with those people unless they share the same experiences. Because once again, each of those two people, or groups of people even, are made up of nothing else than their experiences and their understanding based upon those experiences. And if you don't have the same experiences, you can't understand what these people actually went through, because at its heart is a dehumanizing idea that there is nothing that makes you human except for your experiences. And as I said, this means that only the traditionally underrepresented, the traditionally marginalized, the traditionally oppressed group of people should be represented on a screen or as part of your political system, etc., etc. Why? because those are the people that actually have lived experiences that are according to what is good, and therefore they're the only good people that actually exist. To represent the other kind of people, the toxic masculine people, or the people who believe in logic and reason, the people who want to continue on with the old institutions of our societies, these people are all deemed evil. We don't want anyone to connect with them, therefore they must not be shown on screen. Only the marginalized can be put up on screen. The oppressed, the traditionally underrepresented. That's all you can see, because that's all that needs to be promoted, because these are the good people, not the evil people. The good people are defined by what they believe and what they've experienced, and are confirmed as good as long as they believe progressive ideology and the underpinning ideas of utopian atheistic Marxism. All right, that was actually kind of fun. I probably came up with another 5 minimum definitions that I could have done in my head, but I wanted to limit it to 10. Let me know in the comments if this type of video is something that you would like me to continue on with in the future. And of course, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment if you want to add to this conversation or these definitions in any way. And don't forget, there's a link in the description and in the pinned comment for my newest graphic novel campaign, Crom the Destroyer, a return to form for low fantasy, which employs good old-fashioned storytelling, the tried, tested, and true method within Western civilization, to give you something entertaining and fun. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.